Back to Kufit Chesem and Beis. I might as well learn the Gemara inside of it quickly. Zog to Heilige Gemara. Omar Rav ein yad lepachos mikazayis. If there's less than the kazayis of meat on one end of a bone, the bone won't be a yad for it. And the obvious question is, if it's pachos mikazayis, so what could it do anyway? Even if it was a yad, it's a yad for nothing. So we're going to learn, it could be referring to if you have two bones, and each one is a yad for a half a kazayis, and at the other end of the bone where the meat is, the two bones could be touching. So combined they're kazayis. But each bone is only a yad for a pachos mikazayis. Or ve'ein shomer lapachos mikapol. There has to be shomer lapachos mikazayis, because that's the whole point. The shomer combines with the meat to be a loichel. But even there, you have to start off with something. You need at least the size of a pull, which of course is much smaller than a kazayis. Rabbi Yochanan yesh yad lepachos mikazayis, v'yesh shomer lepachos mikapol. And of course, the Rishonim point out, Rabbi Yochanan didn't just say yesh yad v'shomer lepachos mikapol. He separated into two categories. Yesh yad lepachos mikazayis. Mashma that yes, less than the kazayis could have a yad, but there's still a limit. The limit would be kashir pull. So you wouldn't say yad on something that's less than a pull. But shomer, even the pachas mikabol, even to a tiny strand of meat, you would say that a shomer combines with. Meisvei freik the Gemara. Shnei atzamois va'alein shnei chatzois. The exact case that we talked about earlier. These are human bones, and we know a human bone, if you touch it, it's going to be metama you. But it's not going to be metama anything if it goes into an oil. The only way a human mace could be metame ba'oil is if there's a kizayis of basar in the oil. Then everything in the oil becomes oil mace. Everything in the oil becomes tamei. Here you have two chatzois. Each half his eyes is on one bone, and now you have the other end of those two bones. The other end of those two bones are in an oil. So the question is, do each of these bones, which act as a yad to each of the chatzoi zeisim, to make it as if the chatzoi zeisim are combined together in the oil, which would make that oil into an oil ameis, which would then make everything in that oil tamei. The other end of the bone, the one that the meat was not on, which are the yodois, extended into a house. So if we stop right here, this works out perfectly according to Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Yochanan says, yesh yad lepachos mikazayis. But the problem is, how is Rav going to get along with this Tanakama? Let's look at the second half. Yehuda ben Akusa Omer mishum Rabbi Yaakov heich shnei atzomois mitztarfen lekazayis. And Rashi explains, what is he saying? Heich shnei atzomois im hoya etzem echad uveroisha echad kazayis moedina the yesh lo yad lavi tuma labayis, because yesh yad lekazayis avol yad lepachas mikazayis lo yamrina. So how is Rabbi Yochanan going to correspond with this halacha? So it's a stira on both, because either one, they have a ton against them, and usually each Amoira wants to say that everybody holds like me, right? And they're arguing about something else. So that's the question. Now the Gemara is primarily focusing on Rav, on the question on Rav, but ultimately in the Teretz, the Gemara is going to emphasize Rav and Sai Rabbi Yochanan. So Zok the Gemara, the Rav, hi b'may oikabel. So Rav, the Gemara begins with Rav. How is Rav going to understand this Mishnah? Now, what was the case? There is a bone, and at one end of the bone is meat. Is this bone acting as a shomer, or is this bone acting as a yad? Ibiyad, if it's acting as a yad, then kasher reisha, because you'll have a raya from the Tanakama that you could be a yad lepachos mikazayis. And ibi shomer, so therefore the reisha makes sense, because you could have a shomer less than a kazayis. You just can't have it less than a pull. So therefore, if it's speaking by a shomer, then the reisha makes perfect sense why it works. But then kasher seifa, how is Rav going to understand Rabbi Yaakov, Rabbi Yehuda ben Akusa, Rabbi Yaakov? How will he understand him? That it doesn't work unless you have a full kazayis, but yes, shomer, the pachas mikazayis. Zok the Gemara, we have options. We have a way to explain the Mishnah according to Rav that is talking about a shomer. Biyad. Let's first explain it if it's a yad. Very simple. In fact, Rav will not be able to agree with the Tanakama. Vahuda Amar Rabbi Yehuda ben Akusa. At least it was a simple pshat. Yeah, you're right. Rav cannot agree like both Tanoim. Rav is working with the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda ben Akusa, who says Ein Yad Lapachas B'Gazayis, or V'Bai Seimer B'Shomer. Or you could say that Rav understands that this brisa, this discussion, is by a shomer. But who Amr Tanakama? Now Rav holds like the Tanakama. The Tanakama holds that if it's pachas mi kazayis, it could still be a shomer, and that's why it works. And in fact, he would not agree with Rabbi Yehuda ben Akusa, because Rabbi Yehuda ben Akusa holds that even for a shomer, it wouldn't work. Rabbi Yochanan would say kula b'yad. It would all be speaking about a yad. V'hu Amr Tanakama, and he would hold like the Tanakama, and not Rabbi Yehuda ben Akusa, because he holds ein yad lepachos mikazayis. Now the question here is, why couldn't the Gemara have said that it's speaking b'shomer? Why couldn't they learn that it's speaking b'shomer? Even if it's a shomer, you can still hold like the Chachamim that the two half of Gezeisim are mitzaref. So why can't he learn speaking by a shomer? Why dafka by a yad? Zokt Rashi, because the mashmoyis is it's two chatzoi zeisim. But mashma, if it was 4/4 zeisim, that wouldn't work. If it's speaking by a shomer, according to Rabbi Yochanan, even less than a pull would be mitzaref. So instead of having a brisa arguing about 2 bones with half a gazais on each bone, it could have had 12 bones with a mashu on each bone. And according to Rabbi Yochanan, that would work out shomer. Since the case was strategically picked of less than the kazayis, but not less than the pull, we wouldn't prefer to say that Rabbi Yochanan learns this brisa speaking by a shomer. Rather, it's speaking by a yad, and he will be in agreement with the Tanakama, which ultimately means this is a shtickle lema kitanoi. Right? So Toshma, let's ask you from a different brisa. Rabbi Yehuda Omer kulis sheyesh Allah kazayis basar. Now the kulis is, I think it's the biggest bone, it's like the femur. And Rashi gives us an important piece of information about the kulis. The kulis is a very large bone, and then has a marrow in it. So generally speaking, when you use the word kulis, it's an indication that we're talking about a shomer and not a yad, because the kulis is protecting the marrow within it. And Rashi goes a step further. And Rashi says, even if there's not marrow throughout the entire kulis bone, only, let's say, on half of the bone, you'll still say that the entire bone is a shomer. The bone that's not connected to the marrow is not protecting anything. The teretz is, of course it is, because if it got chopped off there, the marrow would leak out. So therefore, the entire marrow bone, even though there's only marrow in a small portion of the bone, the entire bone would be considered to be a shomer. So kulish generally connotates shomer, and that's going to come out in the Gemara much more clearly. Rabbi Yehuda kulish sheyesh aleh kazayis basar goyreres kula l'tuma. What does it mean, goyreres kula l'tuma? Let's have a look at Rashi. Kulis, hu etzem elyon shel yerech. It's the upper bone of the hip. Uboy moyach tamid. It always has in it marrow. Redundil balaz. The first one is like roundish. It seems like it's the actual hip bone because it has a roundness on it, or maybe it's the thigh bone it's also round. It's the ball that fits into the socket. Goyer es, does the Irish girl say which bone that is? Goyer es kulatoma. So this is a critical Rashi. Oisay zayis, the kazayis of basar of this bone. Goyer es a kulas latoma. This will drag the kulas latoma. What does it mean? It'll drag it latoma. Shem haya im beitza oichlin. If it was touching a kabei of oichlin that was not part of this bone, it was just touching the meat on this bone. V'naga hasheretz ba, and the sheretz touched the bone, the other end of the bone. B'chol makom sheba, any part of the bone, even not keneged the basar. Tameh, it'll be tameh. So this bone will at least act as a yad, even though it might be a shem, it'll at least act as a yad, and it will make everything tameh, even though it itself is only a yad for a pachas mikazayis. So let's see the Gemara inside.
It's negotiation.
Okay, I'm sorry, that's right. That's exactly right. My mistake. It has a kazayis, so it's mashma that it would only work with the kazayis. And the Chayim Oimrim afilu einale elakapul geireris kula latuma. Correct. So here you see a machlokes over here. So Zaklim of a Rav, hi b'may mukimla. How is Rav going to interpret this machlokes? Even yad, if it's a yad and not a shomer, so we're not working with what I mentioned earlier that kulas usually means shomer. If it's being about a yad, then kasha seifa, because Rav will fit very well with Rabbi Yehuda, who says there has to be a kazayis basar. But the seifa says that you all the acherim say you only need a pull, so that would not be consistent with Rav. And Ibi Shomer, and if you want to learn it, speaking by a Shomer, where Yeh Shomer Lepachas Mikazayis, up until a pull, so then he's squarely in the Acherim's camp, not in Rebuda's camp. Kosher Reisha. Zok to Gemara, once again, we have options. Ibi Yisema Biyat, Behuda Mekrav Yehuda, he'll have to agree with Rabbi Yehuda, who holds Ein Yad Lepachas Mikazayis, Ibi Yisema B'Shomer Kacherim. So again, there's no way for Rav to work with both these Tanoim. It's either one or the other, depending on whether or not we're talking about a Yad and a Shomer. Once again, Rabbi Yochanan sticks to Shomer and not to Yad, and the Gemara is going to question that. And he's going to have to hold like Acherim, who holds that up to the pole. The problem is, Acherim HaKapul Ka'amri. Didn't Rabbi Yochanan say that yes, Shomer even Lapachas Mikapul? Yet Acherim says, I feel a kapul, but you need a kapul. So the problem is, how could Rabbi Yochanan say that I am consistent with the acherim if I hold even less than a pull should be mitzarev? Zok the Gemara, really, acherim meant that even if it's less than a pull. So why didn't they say what they mean? Because I did the Ka'amr Tanakama Shiura, since the Tanakama said a shear up until the Kazayis, Ka'amri Iunami Shura, but he didn't really mean it. Omarava, Dekanami, the B'Shomer Askina. And I'll tell you a ride that it's B'Shomer, because we're going to see in Rashi that Rabbi Yochanan had the option to learn that it's speaking by a Yad. Right? So let's say Rabbi Yochanan wanted to learn to speak by Yad. So Rabbi Yehuda Aimer Kula Shieshala Kazayis Basa Gereris Kula Tuma. That doesn't fit in because that seems to say Ein Yad Lapachas Mikazayis. But that's perfect with Rabbi Yochanan because he holds Yad works until a pull. So if you think about it, that would be even a more geshmak upshot because we wouldn't have the problem of Elakapul. But the Gemara holds that Lamaisa is speaking about a Shomer. Dekanami, it's meduyuk that it's speaking about a Shomer. The B'Shomer Askinan, the Katani Kulis. And we know Kulis is the type of bone that always is a Shomer. Shema Mina. Beautiful. Zok Tehelig Gemara weiter. Itmar Rab Chanina Amar. Rab Chanina said, Zehu Shir. This kapul is a shir. It's a valid shir. And it's a minimum. For Rabbi Yochanan Amar Ein Zeh Shir. It's not the kapul that Acherim said isn't really literally, as we just said. He's just using the shir because the Chachamim used the shir, because Rabbi Yehuda used the shir. So Rabbi Yochanan Amar Ein Zeh Shir. What do you mean Ein Zeh Shir? Hakatani kapul. You can't just fabricate that. What do you mean it's not a shir? Acherim said you need to have kapul. No, he didn't really mean that. I need the kamitana kami shiura ka'amri inu nami shiura. Okay, now we'll have another kasha on Rav and Rabbi Yochanan. Tashema, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah mitaher bishel pul umitame bishel kitnias. Now this doesn't mean much to us unless we know what they're talking about. So let's go to Rashi, who will quote for us the first half of this brisa so that we'll understand what they're talking about. So I'm going to slide down into Rashi, and I'm going to look at Rashi Mashmisha, which is relevant a little later, but for now, let's look at Rashi. For Reishit Hachmas Nisa Hachi. Let me tell you what's going on over here. Sharvit Sherik Noitoher. You had like a pod, and the pod had, let's say, peas in it, and you took all of the peas out of the pod. Tar, it's going to be tar because there's no Michael there. The pod itself isn't a Michael. But Shire boy Garger Echad, what if you left one little pea in? Then the loch is Tameh. Why would it be Tameh? Must be because the pod is a shomer to the small pea. So even though the pea is a very small shear, you don't have a full pod of peas. You only have one little one. Nevertheless, the pod will be a shomer and it will be mitzaref, and that's why it will be Tameh. Sheyesh sharvit and harbe. Uchagoyin sheyesh ben hasharvit v'apul kabetza. it means if combined with the volume of the P and the Sharvit Java Kabeya, then it will be Tamei Tumas Eichlin. So you see that Yesh Shomer up until a pull. Okay, let's have a look now at the Brisa. Then the Brisa goes on and says, Rabbi Lezer ben Azariah mitar b'shel pull. He would hold its tor b'shel pull umitama b'shel kidneys. B'shel pull is mitar because you don't. It's not a shomer. The pod is not a shomer to the P. Why? Because the whole reason why something would need a shomer is it would get dirty, it would be hard to clean. The pull is big enough, it won't get dirty. But if it's even smaller than a pull, it's kidneys, there it needs protection. And there the shomer will work. Why? You want to be able to hold these small kidneys in a sheath so you don't touch it, it doesn't become dirty. The pull does not act as a shomer because I don't need it as a shomer, but the kidneys needs a shomer. But you see clearly here that yesh shomer lepachas make a pull, because the kidneys, which is even smaller than the pull, will have the shomer of its pod that will be mitzaref with it to be mitamatum azoichlin. So it's shver on Rav, but it would be a right Rabbi Yochanan. Zok to Gemara kida Amar Rav Acha b'rei derava b'kolcha. We're not talking about one pod with one little bit of kidneys in it. We're talking about holding the stem that has multiple pods hanging off of it. And it's not acting as a shomer. That's acting as a yad, umishum yad. So when you're holding that stem that has a whole bunch of pods on it, it yesh yad, because it's more than the kazayis, because if you combine all of the kidneys, even if you don't look at the pods, you just look at the kidneys, there's more than the kabeya of kidneys there, and therefore, when you're holding that main stem, it is a yad to Yosy mikazayis, and that would fit in perfectly with Rav. So Rav Acha Rava said bekulcha regarding something else. We're going to apply that here as well. Hachanami bekulcha umishum yad. Fragt Gemara, so umay b'mashmishon. Didn't Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah say mipnei sheroitzi b'mashmishon? Mashmishon means it's protecting you. You don't want to get dirty. So how could you fataichus as a yad from the explanation that Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah gives and must be speaking about a shomer? So no, it means bitashmishon, just to be able to carry them. And it's not acting as a shomer, rather it's acting as a yad. Let's have a quick peek in Rashi. We actually learned part of the Rashi already. So let's start from here. V'tamei bishal kidneys, the shomerhu, because in the Havamim it's acting as a shomer. The dakamim, since these kidneys are very small, ve'en yechoydel l'nakrin, it's hard to wash them off, so you want to keep them protected in their pods. V'nichalei sheyehu ba'osim sharvitin v'al yisar b'em soilas. The Balabais is very happy to keep them protected in their sharvit, and that makes it a shomer. B'mashmishon shememashmish b'nayidei sharvit. How does the owner want you to be handling these small kidneys? Through the sheath, which keeps them pristine. V'reishadach masnisin hachi sharvit sharik nay tahar shire boy gager echa tami sheyei sharvitin harbe. There are many sharvitin on this whole stem. Uchagoyin sheyesh bin hasharvit v'apul kabetza. But Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah mitar b'shal pul. The ein shomer mitzar v'loy lekabeya. He holds the shomer will not be mitzar lekabeya, but u'mitama b'shal kitniyos alma yesh shomer lepachas mikapul, and that was a kasha on Rav, a right Rabbi Yochanan, and v'degmar b'kolcha. Had the mitama b'shal kitniyos lav b'sharvit. He's not referring to the sheath, to the pod, umishum shomer, el b'klach noga tomo umishum yad. It touched the main stem that has many, many kidneys hanging off of it. The hashtav hayad yad ledover choshev shu yosher mikazayis sherekola sharvitin nuchubarim boy ubepul hoil begasamein, since they're much thicker. Lo yichbes they don't need a yad. You can hold it themselves, but the whole tiny little things, it's much easier to hold it by a handle that contains many of them. Bitashmishon shemetaltlin boiseklach. That's how you carry them. Boiseklach is tashmish la'oichel. That's serving the oichel. Never mind the pods. It's serving all the kidneys. Gewaltig. Zog to Gemara weiter. Tashma. The Tana de Rabbi Shmuel. Another kash. Al kol zera zerua asher zareya. This was the makar of shomer, right? This is how we learned that shomer is mitzaref. Kederach shebnei adam ma'itzion chita b'kliplasa usor b'kliplasa v'adoshim b'kliplasa. Guess what? A kernel of chita is much smaller than a pole. A kernel of soyer is much smaller than the pole as a single adosha. So you see clearly from here that you don't need a sheer pull for a shomer from the source itself. Gemara beria shiny. Achita is a complete beria. When we're talking about ein shomer lepachas mikapul, that's if it's a piece of meat. It's not a davar choshev in and of itself. But a beria has its own set of rules. As we had, if you eat a namala, which is much smaller than the kazayis, you're chayiv. Why? Because you ate a complete beria. Zokt Rashi beria shiny. V'chikam arav shein shomer lepachas mikapul kechayin chatzi pull shein b'yosei shlema. I have a pull of some item of food that's not a complete entity. Oy basar or a piece of meat, sheer chatzi pull. V'or olav shemashlim lekabeya. And we wanted to say that the or on it is a shomer that would combine with this lesser piece of meat to become a kabeya. Ulil nami gabeshavitin motzil latruse beria shiny. Really, that's what the Gemara could have answered earlier, because we're talking about individual items. So there's no kasha that there's less than a pull, because each one is an individual P, an individual item. So really, you could have answered it that way. But the Gemara in our base is going to say that using the answer of beria is a doichik. We like having better terutzim than that. I thought it's a very good answer. It's a davar choshev. I thought it's a choshev answer. But we'll see the Gemara on the Amaz base doesn't like it. Zok the Gemara weiter. Boy Rabbi has the following shaila. Shnei shoymrin ma'u sheyitztarfu. Rashi says ma'u sheyitztarfu lo'oichel shebesoichan l'kabeya. So somehow there were two shoymrin. How would that be possible? Hechadami. Ilam bezel gavzeh. If it's a shomer on top of a shomer, so you have like two layers of shells, like in an onion. Zok Gemara, we know for sure a shomer al gav shomer does not act as a shomer. It will not be mitzaref. There's 3 layers of peeling the layers of an onion. Penimis, ben shleima ben kedura, whether it's complete or it's cut, which it no longer can act as a shomer. If it's damaged, mitzdarefes. You know why? Because it itself is an oichel. It's edible itself. And so it's the middle one. Shleima, that's not edible. But if it's complete, so it's acting as a protection to the onion, then mitzdarefes. But kedura, if it's broken, ain't mitzdarefes. Chitzayne, the outer peel, which just flakes right off, benkach u benkach tahira, because that is a shomer al gabe shomer, and that for sure does not qualify. So that can't be Rabbi Oshia shaila. He wouldn't declare a shaila about something that's we have a Meforsha Mishnah to clarify. So K'mo, you're right. Rabbi Oshia shaila was different. Rabbi Oshia shomer oichel shechalkoi kami boile. What's the case? Rashi says it means shomer oichel shechalkoi kegoin oichel kapetza. You do have an oichel that's the shir of a kapetza. The shomer olav, and it has a shomer on it. But the chalka, you cut it in half. So now you have 2 half a kabeya, and each half a kabeya has its own shomer because it's cut in half. Oy kegoin shnei bitzalim tanim, or 2 small onions. She'ein b'shneim ela kabetza im shomerin. That if you add together the mass of these 2 onions, including the mass of their shomerin, then and only then will you have a kabetza. The kamaboyle im mitzarfi hani shomerin min oichel eloi. Oichel or mitzaref. But who said the shomer on the half a kabeya will be mitzaref with the other shomer, because we need them all. We need all of their mass to combine to be a kabetza. That's how Rashi learns the shaila. Tosfos argued, and Tosfos says, "Loi shechol kol legamri." It's not like you cut an onion in half, as Rashi explains. Then came shita the loy mitzaref kedeprecious lail. Then it for sure would not be mitzaref. L'hachi noket nami dafke cholkoi. Aval shnei goizim, but 2 separate nuts, which Rashi also says is a shaila. Shein shnei oichlin shleimim pshita the loy mitzarfim. So what is the case? Elamayri kagoin sheyesh kan basar. You have basar, the or olav, and there's or on the basar, the chol kaila or. So you had the meat was in one unit. It's just the or the shomer you split. That's going to be the shaila. So zok to Gemara. Kivan the high loy megan the high. Since the shomer for this side is not doing anything for the other side, the high loy megan the high maybe loy mitzdarefes, and these 2 shomerim cannot be considered as part of the total mass to bring it up to a kabetza. Oidilma kivan the high megan nadi day, by megan nadi day mitzdarfen, because each one is being a shomer to part of the food item. Toshma. Rabbi Loza ben Azariah metar bishal pul. This should be a very familiar brisa. We just learned it on Amud Aleph. Umetame bishal kitnius. Mipnei sheroitza b'mashmishan. We're going back to the Hava, meaning that we're discussing shomer and not yad. So what do you see from here? You see from here is that the shomer is going to work. Let's see Rashi. Umetame bishal kitnius. Kosol kedaite sheshnayim u'shloisha sharvitin mitzdarfin lekabeya imochlin shaben. It's mashma that you could even combine multiple pods together. The vada ein b'sharvet echad kebetza. We'll all agree that there wouldn't be enough content in one pod to be a shir kebetza. So what do you see from here? Alma shnei shayim mitzdarfin im shnei oichlin lekebetza. This pod with its peas and that pod with its peas will all combine. So you have a pshitos to Rab Oshi Shaila. Amar Bachaber de Rava. Here is the Rabbi Achaber de Rava that we were referencing on Amar Aleph. Bekolcha. We're not speaking about shomer. We're speaking about yad. Umishum yad. Umay b'mashmishan b'tashmishan. Exactly the same thing that we answered on Amar Aleph. To for the shita of Rav. Toshma. The Tana Devei Rabbi Shmuel. It says Al Kol Zera Zerua. This should be a very familiar raya. We also just encountered this on Amar Aleph. Kederech shebnei adam ma'itzian lizriya. Chita b'klipasa, usar b'klipasa, v'dashim b'klipasa. So once again, there can't be about one chita, because one chita is not a sheer pull. It must be that there's multiple chitas, that if you add the mass of all the chitas with all of their shells, all of their shomrim, then you will reach the shir kabetza. So once again, you have a raya that the shomrim of different items must be mitzaref. So tomorrow we have the same answers before. Once again, we're speaking about the stem. You're talking about someone who's holding the entire stalk of wheat. So everything is combined in that stalk. See here, the Gemara didn't say beria. So Rashi says, "Kid Omar chitin b'klipasan." Zok Rashi alma chitin im sharmei mitzarfen lekabetza alma shnei shayim mitzarfen v'odin loichol shalokay. Rashi holds that it's not a good teretz to say beria shiny, but if you look at the tziyonim, he takes that out. It's not a tchika. So I'm not sure we just have to know that there would have been that option to answer beria. But the Gemara answers here bekulcha. When you hold a stalk of wheat, that's a yad to everything in the entire stock, which is definitely a kibetza. Umishum yad. So hachanami. We'll say over here to Beshedra, you're holding the center of the stalk, umishum shomer. Now, we still are getting everything to be mitzaref, because we still need obviously the psoilas to combine in order to have a kabeya, because you don't have a kabeya of wheat alone. So it has to be a shomer. Now the question here is, the way a stalk of wheat is laid out is the bottom straws that stick out of the main stalk hold a little bundle of wheat, and then there's some more straws on top of it and more wheat. The problem is it's like that pickup stick game. If you pull the bottom one out, the whole thing comes collapsing down. So the bottom one is going to be a shomer for everything. But the top one, if you pull that out, you only maybe lose the top. You don't lose anything below it. So the problem is the bottom one is going to be a shomer and everything. But the top psoilison, they're not going to be a shomer only for the things above. So Zog to Gemara, hachanami b'shedro mishum shomer. Fragt Gemara b'shlama Elisa, I understand shrichi litatisa. I understand why the upper ones require the lower ones, because if you pull the lower one out, they all go tumbling down. Elatatisa, my shrichi Elisa. So how is it that the upper ones are a shomer? They're not a shomer to the bottom ones. They're only a shomer to the top one. So you'll have a raya that even though it's only a shomer to the ones on top, it still could combine with the ones on the bottom. So once again, you have a raya to Oshi Shaila. So we're just saying that even in one row, all of those are going to be mitzaref with the psoilus around it to be a kabeya. But if you look at a wheat kernel, it's not that big. How are you going to have one little row in a stalk? There's not enough wheat kernels, even with the chaff and the stalks. There's not enough here that there'll be a kabetza. So how could you just say we're only speaking about one row at a time? Zaktamar, you know what type of wheat we're talking about? Not your regular everyday wheat. It's Bechiti de Shimon ben Shetach. What was the story of the Chiti of Shimon ben Shetach? Zokt Rashi, Kishtei Kloyoy Shel Shar Hagadol. His wheat kernel was the size of 2 kidneys of a large ox. So his wheat was literally on steroids. Frek to Gemara, if you're dealing with such big chitin, why do I even need 1 row? 1 stalk is good enough. Bechiti de Shimon ben Shetach. Hasha dasas lachi, chada chita nami bechiti de Shimon ben Shetach. The whole kasha was 1 chita is not big enough. So how could it be? So it must be the multiple chita marmitzarif? No, we're talking about a chita that was big enough. So that answers all of our kashas from Amaral, from Amadeis. Gufa. Now we're going to go back to that case with the tumas mace with the 2 bones. Shnei atzomois, the aleyan shnei chatzoi zeisim, the hichnas rosheim sheni. The other end went into a bias. The bias mal aleyan only on the bone. The meat sticking off is on the other end of the bone. That's not in the oil. Habayis tamei. Rabbi Yehuda ben Nekusa Eimer Mishum Rabbi Yaakov Heich Shnei Atzomois Mitzdarfa Lekazayis. Right, we had that brayso, we brought a right to Rabbi Yochanan, we brought a right to Rav. Now everything worked out. Omer Shlokish Lo Shanu Ela Etzem the Havayad. If there's a piece of bone sticking into the house, yes, that would extend the tumah into the house. Avol Nima, what if it was just a hair? A hair was sticking out of the meat, out of the hide, and it stuck into the house. Would that be able to be a yad to extend the tumah to the house? Lo have a yad. You know why? Because if you grab a hair, it's going to fall out. So you can't carry a whole piece of meat by holding a hair. It's going to just rip off, or a small fiber of meat. Rabbi Yochanan Amar afilu nima nami have a yad. Esei Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish. I'll show you that even a 1 hair could be a yad, because it says or sheyesh alov kazayis basar. If you have an or that has a kazayis basar connected to it. If there's a small little piece of strand of meat sticking out that you touched, or or hair on the other side of the hide, where there might not be meat there, tamei will be tamei. My love, mishum yad. Let's say it's mishum yad, and you see clearly uvenima uvisayir shekenegdoi works for yad. So you have a raya that it works for yad. Zok to Gemara. Loi mishum shomer. We're working as a shomer, and the hair is not at the other end of the meat. The hair is right there, kineged the basar. So it's a shomer because it's protecting the meat. What do you mean it's protecting the meat? The hide is protecting the meat, and the hair is out of the hide. So it's a shomer l'shomer. Umiika shomer al gabi shomer. So the Gemara, no, chelchulim mechalchol. The hide, the way hair grows out of hide, is it penetrates through the skin layer. So there's technically a tiny hole in the hide. So that a little hole is filled with the hair. So the hair is mamash a shomer l'basar, not a shomer to the hide, because it penetrates right through the hide. So you're telling me that there's multiple holes in any hide? You're telling me every hide is hiding multiple holes, right? How could you ever have kasher tefillin written on the hide? Because there's holes in the hide. And there's going to be little holes in the letters. Zakt Gemara, he forgot. Yaakov forgot an important rule we learned about safras. Hadami b'marava kol shnekev kol nekev shed the overlov eno nekev. If the ink will just go over the hole and not fall through, so the letter will remain the same because that little gap, the surface tension of the ink will extend right over it. It'll basically cover the hole. That's not called a hole. So the holes are small enough that it wouldn't be a problem for writing safras on it. But technically, if you look under a microscope, you'll see there's a tiny hole with which the hair follicle penetrates the hide. V'boyzema, maybe kula mishum yad. Maybe it's all about yad. You're going to ask me, how could 1 hair be a yad? You try to lift up the piece of meat, it's going to rip right out. So how would you explain that according to Rish Lakish? If you grab a whole bundle of hair, yes, that will have enough strength to reach it up. So therefore, the hair could be a yad when you're grabbing multiple strands of hair together. Now, Rabbi Loi said that the gabi something else. We're going to apply it here. Hachanami benima shebein hanimin. V'heiche idmar to Rabbi Lo. Where did Rabbi Lo say this chiddush? That if you pull a whole bunch of hair together, that will have the strength and that will be a yad. Aha. Meloi shebeshibolim mitamin umitamin. The little whiskers that stick out of a stalk of wheat could act as a yad. They could transmit tuma in and out. But the enim mitzarfin. But you're not going to say that they're a shomer, that they could be mitzaref and add to the shear. One of those little whiskers, if you pull it, it's not going to lift up the whole wheat. If you pull a whole bunch of whiskers together, yes, that will hold up the entire stock. So that's where you see this concept that it could act as a yad, even though it itself is not strong enough, but if you grab them together, it will be. Lishnachvina, Amrila, Hachanami Mistavra, the Mishum Shomer, it must be work with Shomer, not with Yad. So this last teretz was it's working al Siyad. No, it's going back to a Shomer. You asked me a question. If it's Shomer, how could you have a Shomer al Gabi Shomer? So the Gemara answers Chalchul Mechalchal. So Zok Gemara, it makes sense to learn that the case was Shomer and not Yad. Yad, Nima Achas Lamai Chazi. Yad wouldn't work. Going back to the same question. And there, the Kedamar Beloi, no, it could even be a Yad as well. The B'Meloi Shebein HaMeloi, Nachanami B'Nima Shebein HaNimin. V'hech with Rabeloi, this is basically a repeat of the earlier sugya, but coming from a different angle. Aodetnan, HaMeloi Shebeshabolon, Mitamin, and Mitamin Ve'Mitzarfin, Meloi Lai Chazi, Amar Beloi, B'Meloi Shebein HaMeloim, period. V'ikid Masnala Masnisin, and there are those who learn this whole thing is relevant to our Mishnah. So Rashi, the Katani, our Mishnah says, Atzomois Mitzarfin. Bones are mitzaref. We had in our Mishnah that bones would even be mitzaref to the shir kabetza. There has to be shomer. The yad le mitzaref. So in our Mishnah, there's an orva right of a kippah mitzarefin. We said bones are mitzaref because they act as a shomer to the marrow inside it. The tamat masoichlot. Omer shlokas lo shonu ela etzem. That would only apply to an etzem. Avol nima lo have a shomer. Rabbi Yochanan Amar afilu nima nami have a shomer. So we're going to have literally a repeat of what we just learned. So we might as well rush to the two dots because it's literally word for word what we just learned. So it's acting as a shomer. Or exactly the same kash as before. Once again, you see that even a nima is good. So it's working out yad. What good is one nima? So basically, it's the same sugi chazan over, but the source where we're starting from is from our Mishnah rather than from a standalone machlokes Rabbi Yochanan Shlokish. Okay, Gavaltik. We'll stop here. Message tomorrow. We will match tomorrow. I'm only going to be online. So tomorrow, which is Friday, Motzei Shabbos, and Sunday and Monday, I'm going to be online. Tuesday, I'm driving through the night, Monday night, so I'm not sure what time I'll arrive. Muncie. So if I arrive on time, we'll do it that way. Now, the other question is Shabbos, I have not yet found anybody to say shir, because usually I ask Avram, but Avram's away. So we will see if I can find somebody.